Dear students, we are going to study about psycholinguistics, lecture number 4. Now, what we are going to discuss is, what I would like to clear beforehand, before we start, is that in the start I gave you an introduction of sociolinguistics and then an introduction of psycholinguistics. But we have continued studying psycholinguistics now, so we will continue studying for further some more lectures about psycholinguistics. When we complete that, then we will start on sociolinguistics. So please don't be confused with the pattern. First of all, we will continue on from where we ended the lecture last time. So we were studying about the psychology of language. Now today what we want to study is the scope of psycholinguistics. Now psycholinguistics is part of the field of cognitive science. We've already discussed that, and is the study of how individuals comprehend, produce and acquire language. So how individuals would comprehend, that means how they would understand it, how they would produce it, like deliver the language, and how they acquire the language. It mainly addresses two questions. Now these are very important because you want to pay attention when trying to understand what psycholinguistics is. Basically, you want to pay attention to these questions. So the first question would be, what knowledge of language is needed for us to use language? Like, how much do we need to know to use a language? So how we gain the knowledge is a different source. But then how much do we need? Now who will decide that how much information do we need about a certain language before we can say that we are proficient in it? And the second question would be, what cognitive processes are involved in the ordinary use of language? So we're going to see about those also. Now psycholinguistics are also interested, the people who research at psycholinguists are also interested in the social rules involved in language use and the brain mechanisms associated with language. So like we had discussed previously, it's all about how your mind perceives the language. So continuing this point, we would say, like, number one, language processes and linguistic knowledge. That means how the language is processed and how much linguistic knowledge we have. B would be illustrations of language processing. So further on, then, general psychological mechanisms. Now both comprehension and production of language are performed within the constraints of our information processing system. Now we have a system in our brain which processes the information that we gather from our daily lives or our daily routine and from different languages. Now both comprehension, trying to understand that process, and how to produce that process. So we want to, it's all about the system going in our brain. So the system consists of structural components, memory systems, along with a set of control processes that govern the flow of information within the system. So it's all about structural components and mostly based on our memory. Because if we don't memorize about a language, then how could we remember all the guidelines of a particular language, the grammar, the rules, and all the vocabulary? So making and forming structure of a sentence also would be tough. So what we do is that we, this whole process would concern with a set of control processes that governs the flow of information. Now, how much information our system can withhold, how much can we save in our memory. So part A of that would be the information processing system. That would be one part. This part B would be central issues in language processing. Now in central issues in language processing would be serial versus parallel processing. we step by step either we learn something, or we parallel at the same time, side by side, we are learning two different things. Top down versus bottom up processing. We're going from top to the bottom, or from bottom to top of learning process, just like you would go with an alphabet. Automatic versus controlled processes. Like automatically your brain processes something, and you know, because if it, like for example, let's say your native language. Now in your native language, you already automatically know so many meanings of vocabulary and so many processes in the sentence construction and the syntax of a sentence. So forming a sentence or trying to comprehend or understand it is not difficult. That is an automatic process. Like as soon as you hear something, you will immediately understand it, and that understanding process comes by the automatic process. But controlled processes, now that's when we are controlling ourselves to either learn something new, save it to our memory, or process it further on. So modularity versus interactivity. Also, once again, and 2C would be development of the processing system. Next we would study would be language comprehension. Now these are all the things, these step by step what I'm pointing out is, in this, is all parts of psycholinguistics and why we study psycholinguistics. So language comprehension is a part also. In this part we will examine language comprehension at a number of levels of processing for the convenience of exposition. So bit by bit we will try to understand the levels of processing, how our brain or our thoughts would process a language. Then levels of speech processing, word processing, internal lexicon, syntactic parsing, and sentence understanding, connected discourse comprehension. These are all part of language comprehension. So in speech processing, how we produce the speech, words processing, how we make the words and how we join the words to make a sentence. Syntactic parsing, that once again is the structure of a sentence, or how we form a sentence. And sentence understanding, that would be the semantic point of view. And connected discourse comprehension. Now all of these, now perception of language, when we divide it into, I've divided it for your comfort, that you can further on see that when we divide those into parts, then perception of language comes first. Identification of isolated speech sounds and of continuous speech. The perception, how we perceive a language. Identification of isolated speech sounds, how we isolate different speech sounds and how we understand it. And of continuous speech, and how we continue to speak. Then the internal lexicon. Like in the previous slide we just read that it's a part of language comprehension. So the internal lexicon, now what is the internal lexicon? It's a representation and organization of semantic knowledge. Semantic, like I told you, the study of understanding the meaning of the words. So internal lexicon would be representation and organization of semantic knowledge, how we organize it in our brains. Lexical access, lexical is your vocabulary. Access processes in comprehension. So how you comprehend it. Then comprehension of sentences. Now what does that mean? Comprehension of sentences means understanding of sentences. Now syntactic and semantic, a psychologist's approaches to the construction of interpretations. So it's using both of it. It's using the syntactic, the structure of a sentence, and the semantic, the knowledge of finding the meanings of the words. The psycholinguistics approaches the construction to interpret that, to try to understand it, to translate it. Next would be discourse comprehension. Now, that would be a word you would be thinking, what does discourse comprehension mean? Comprehension of discourse. Discourse is conversation. Memory for discourse. Schemata and discourse processing. So all of these are a part of language comprehension. Further on we would go, number 4 would be language production and conversational interaction. Now, how do we produce a language, and how in a conversation do we interact with people? How do we use a language to interact with people? So language production can be viewed as consisting in 4 major stages. So once when we say that language production, we would say that language production can be viewed as 4 major stages. Number 1 would be conceptualizing a thought to be expressed, formulating a linguistic plan, articulating the plan, and monitoring one's speech. So what is it doing? Conceptualizing a thought to be expressed. यानी आप एक thought या एक सोच को realize करते हो, ठीक है, और उसको ताकि आप उसको express कर सको, बयान कर सको. Formulating a linguistic plan. आप किस तरह deliver करोगे language को. Articulating the plan. Articulation means by the sounds or the way you pronounce the words. Monitoring one's speech, and then how you monitor your own speech. Now these various stages will be examined in this part further on when we study. That let's start with production of speech and language. So when we examine this, then serial versus parallel models of linguistic planning, implementing linguistic plans, articulating and self-monitoring. So what is it doing in production of speech and language? We are monitoring ourselves. We are self-monitoring our speech. That's how our mind works. When we are speaking, we ourselves are sure and we are correcting ourselves. Like our thoughts, when we are putting our thoughts into words to express it, we automatically would put it in the proper structure if we know the language. Second would be conversational interaction. आप जिस तरह आपस में बात करते हैं, conversation create करते हैं, interaction होता है आपका. The structure of conversations, conversational skills, conversational settings. Now it really matters. Conversational interaction में आपका ये चीज़, the structure of conversation, मतलब कि आपका किस base के ऊपर आपकी conversation चल रही है. Conversational skills, आपके conversational skills कितने अच्छे हैं. Are you a shy person or are you a bold person? Are you good in that language? Can you speak well? Is your voice clear? Can people understand what you are saying? आपकी pronunciation words की, आपका sound level, आपका pitch आवाज़ की, ठीक है, ये सारी चीज़ें आपकी skills में आते हैं. If everything is perfect, then that would be a skill, a bonus skill. Conversational settings, then once again, depends on the situations and the settings around you, where you're having that conversation. Next would be language acquisition. Now, how we acquire a language. Now, in early language acquisition means like in the start, how we start learning a language. Children's construction of language emerges from their understanding of communication prior to language. Now, how children, we've taken this example, like how children would understand or construct a language. That emerges or that happens by the understanding of communication. Before they even learn the language, they learn how to communicate or construct the language. They're hearing words, everybody is talking around them and they pick words. And then they know how to do it even before they've learned to properly speak the language. So you've noted maybe in children that sometimes they have a habit of instead of saying full sentences, they would take 2 or 3 words and combine them. Now in that they're learning to construct in that language. They have no knowledge prior about that language, so they are starting to learn. So they would take either say a single word or mix 2 or 3 words without grammar. Now their comprehension and production of gestures reveals a basic understanding of communication process. उनका जो अंडरस्टैंडिंग है या प्रोडक्शन है जो वो अपने जेस्चर्स से शो करते हैं, ठीक है, अपनी मूवमेंट से शो करते हैं बच्चे, दैट रिवील्स कि उनको बेसिक अंडरस्टैंडिंग है लैंग्वेज कम्युनिकेशन की, उनको समझ आती है, इवन दो कि उनके पास इतनी वोकैबुलरी नहीं है, बोल नहीं सकते, बट दे कैन अंडरस्टैंड इट. Now, although children first acquire the sound system of their native language independently of meaning, they eventually merge it with communicative gestures to form productive speech. So even बच्चों का जो है वो जब first time when they get the language, they first acquire the sound system, pronounce कैसे करते हैं words को, और वो they will learn about it about their native language. Native language would be where they're living, what their parents speak. The language that is spoken around them, that would be their native language. So they first acquire the sound system of the native language without understanding the meaning. They might not even know what they are saying. Sometimes we find it very funny in our families when kids would imitate a grown-up and say something that they really don't realize what they're saying or what it means, but they just repeat it because they've heard the sounds. So they take the word and they repeat it. Now that proves how our brain works separately in producing or understanding a language even before we know the meaning of the language or the words. So communicative gestures form productive speech. Later on they merge both of these things, the sound system of learning and pronouncing words, and then their gestures and the meanings, and that becomes and turns into productive speech, and they can learn how to make complete sentences. Now the development of one-word speech comprises 2 important developments. A one-word speech has 2 important developments: the acquisition of the lexicon and the use of single words to express larger chunks of meaning. So they acquire the language, the use of single words to express larger chunks of meaning. That means, like I just explained to you, that even though they don't understand the meaning of the words or they don't have a great vocabulary, they can use even single words to explain. Like kids have a habit of saying, if they are thirsty, they would learn would be water or pani. And they don't have to say it that mujhe pani peena hai, that I want to drink water. All they have to say is water, and the elders will understand. So the single words to express larger chunks of meaning, they use that. Then children's first word combinations reveal a structure that is neither an imitation of adult speech nor fully grammatical by adult standards. So once when we see children, the way they combine words and the structure, they don't have a proper structure when they're combining words. So it's neither by the imitation of the adults, that they can't learn by imitation even the grammar. Sometimes kids don't understand that speech, or they can fully use grammar like the adults use it, but they can get their meaning across. So in a way we understand that the brain processes the language. Our thoughts are working. The child can understand what we are studying, but he can not use it in a grammatical way or in a way that the adults would, in full sentences. So further studying that, it would be pre-linguistic communication. Now before they even have the ability of gathering the linguistic communication. So that would be one. Then early phonology, normal and disordered development of speech perception and speech production. So early phonology would be that either normal kids or adults, or disordered development of speech perception and speech production. Or disordered would be people who cannot properly pronounce or speak, or maybe are hearing impaired or are mute, and the perception of their speech and how they produce the speech. Then once again, early lexical development. Now in the first one we would say early lexical development, that means like learning the vocabulary. So how early do you start? That's when as childhood, you start learning vocabulary by single words. Normal and disordered development, once again, same thing. Then early grammar. Now normal and disordered syntactic growth. Emergence of grammatical categories. So it's the grammatical categories start emerging in the language. They start coming forth. So children would start learning an early grammar. It could be in a normal way or not. And syntactic growth, how they learn to structure a sentence and how it grows. And from that, how the grammatical categories emerge. Then later language acquisition. Now that was early language acquisition. This is later language acquisition. Now children's grammatical development in the late preschool years includes the acquisition of grammatical morphemes and complex syntactic structures. So how do children learn later on in their preschool years? Now preschool years are their early school years, because they are being taught. Now gradually, even like you can see, आपको भी ग्रामर एक लेवल पे स्कूलिंग में आपको सिखाई गई है, ठीक है, आपको इंग्लिश ग्रामर सिखाई गई है, उर्दू ग्रामर सिखाई गई है. So उसमें you learn how to structure a sentence. आप sentence structure, उसका formation, उसकी morpheme, sounds उसकी, ठीक है, वो चीज़ learn करते हैं. How to pronounce it, the tenses. So in preschool years, children learn or acquire the grammatical morphemes. They also progressively extend their repertoire of both direct and indirect speech acts, and master the thematic status of given versus new information, being more able to communicate in flexible ways. So while they are learning in their preschool years the grammar rules, they also progressively extend their repertoire of both direct and indirect speech acts. So they are learning how to communicate in a direct speech and in a indirect speech. Now in direct speech would be that I want to shut that door. That would be an example. I want to shut the door. But an indirect speech would be, I would like that door to be shut. That would be an example. When I am referring to something but indirectly. And master the thematic status of given versus new information. Whatever information they have been given, it versus that, versus the new information that they're gathering. Like whatever they already have, the information and the knowledge, and what they gather further on. Now being more able to communicate in flexible ways, that gives them a more variety, because once they're learning the grammatical rules, it's easier for them to communicate in flexible ways. They can like extend their knowledge. Now children's skills are conversationalists and narrators grow from preschool to late school years. Now how a child's skill develops and grows as a conversationalist, the way they would make conversation, or as a narrator, it grows from preschool to the late school years. They keep on developing. Like language learning never stops. You can't say that a child has learned a language and that is it. In our schooling, we keep on learning. We learn about, in the early schools, we learn about grammar rules. Further on, we would learn more vocabulary. By the time we come to the university, we are learning more difficult vocabulary, more difficult structure of sentences. Then when we are doing our MS and PhDs, we are required to know the language so perfectly, like even writing essays or speaking or presenting. Our English has to be immaculate. So in a way that we keep on, the learning process never ends. We keep on learning. Now in later grammar, once in preschool they've learned the basic early grammar. Now in later grammar, normal and disordered syntactic development, acquisition of complex sentences. So later on, what they start learning is, in both situations, in structure development, that they are acquiring difficult, complex sentences. They're learning that. So in the start, like a child would start with learning the alphabets and then pronouncing what alphabet stands for what. For example, like this is a cup, this is a ball, this is an apple, and further on. But like now, like when you are studying this, for example, explaining to you what normal and disordered syntactic development is, or acquisition of complex sentences. Now this is complex sentences. This is what you are learning now. So later on, every part in your life, you keep on learning new things. And normal and disordered elaboration of language functions. For example, speech acts, thematic structure processing, how you process the structure, what speech acts. Then normal and disordered development of discourse processes in children, conversational skills, narrative skills. So those are judged later on. Then comes the processes of language acquisition. Now, what are the processes in which you acquire a language? That's very important. So language acquisition is studied in relation to three classes of variables. There are three variables, three different types, how to study acquiring a language or obtaining a language. Environmental factors, cognitive processes, and innate linguistic mechanisms. Most of the time we learn from our environment. Let's say, for example, if you're living in a village and you were trying to learn English. Now, the people around you don't know the language, so you don't communicate with them. So when you're communicating is only when you are studying, either with your fellow students or with your teachers. So when you are learning the language, those environmental factors really make a difference in the learning. Now, if you had people living around you in your village who spoke English, then it would be much easier for you to learn the language. But once again, your mind is processing the information, your mind is gathering the information. You are understanding what is going on. Maybe some of the words are difficult, some of the vocabulary is difficult, but your brain is processing it. So first part would be gross environmental neglect or abuse may retard language acquisition. So if you neglect it, if you don't speak the language, you would forget it. Abuse may retard, if you contort a language, that would decline in your learning of language. Let's say, for example, now I'll give you a very good example for that. Now in nowadays, the children have learned how to text on their mobile phones. Now, when they text, they would shorten and use abbreviations or abbreviated forms of words. Once we start using that, we get so used to it, and the students and the children, they get so used to using that language that if they've been asked to write something formal in their university or colleges, they would just by habit go and write the same thing in abbreviated forms. Like for you, instead of using Y-O-U, they would just use U, the letter U, and such. So sometimes abuse of language may retard the way how you acquire a language, yet the precise aspects of the environmental necessary for normal language growth are not clear. So we can't though say that if you grow up in such and such environment, then your growth of language or how you obtain a language would be much better than another person in a different environment. So there is no guarantee about it. You could be living in a place where people are speaking the language, but maybe if you don't have an interest or you don't have the ability, you would not learn it. So some evidence indicates that cognitive achievements facilitate language development. Sometimes they say that cognitive achievements would facilitate means that it would enhance your language development and how you learn the language. Now, children given only improvised linguistic input are able to create communicative systems that are similar to early child language, which suggests some innate guidance in early language acquisition. So when they are not properly given the access to linguistic input, then and are not, or maybe are able to create communicative systems, they are similar to early child language. That means that they're learning like in their early childhood. They're imitating and they are learning. Now the same way, once again I'll give you a simple example for that, that when you watch movies, many of the youngsters would, they love to imitate the accents. Now, when they are imitating, once again, they're going back to the same form that when they were learning in their early childhood. They're imitating. So, it suggests that some guidance in early language acquisition is needed. And now, the guidance, like if we divide it into three parts, with contribution of environmental factors, so how the environment contributes, contribution of cognitive processes, how it contributes to cognitive processes, contribution of innate mechanisms, inbuilt. Psychology of language or psycholinguistics now. There are three goals in preparing these lectures. When we want to teach you about psycholinguistics, it's not just teaching you a subject, but making you try to understand what these two things are. We discussed sociolinguistic, that it's related to the society, and psycholinguistic to the brain. But how, when we are, what we are trying to achieve by this. Now when we study psycholinguistics or the psychology of language, we want to achieve, mostly we are looking for to achieve three goals. To define basic notions that that will be used to analyze both normal and impaired oral and written language. So first of all, the notions that would analyze, like normal for normal speech, impaired for the children who cannot hear or speak, oral, spoken language, and written language. The second thing that we would want, the goal would be to present the principles of psycholinguistics in an accessible manner. Like what we are trying to do is to present to you the principles in an easy way, in a way that you can easily understand. Now, taking into account recent developments of cognitive psychology and neuropsychology. We keep in mind we use both of the cognitive psychology and neuropsychology. Third goal would be to discuss some fundamental psycholinguistic issues in reference to basic psychological mechanisms that constitute our information processing system, on which our information processing system is based. So, the question would be, now, what is psycholinguistics? Now, for a few minutes, I would like you students to sit and think. Up till now, when you have already been explained what psycholinguistics is, what do you think it is? Now, psycholinguistics, like I told you, is the study of how the thoughts process the language and how you put it into language. Could it be in written form, in spoken form, or in sign language, but how you put your emotions and your thoughts into language and the way you mix both of them. That is psycholinguistics. So this question I would like you to ponder. What is psycholinguistics? Psycholinguistics is the study of how individuals use, comprehend, produce, and acquire language. Now, when somebody asks you, what is psycholinguistics? Why are you studying it? Then that's what you would be answering. You would say that it's a study of how individuals, you yourself, would use the language, comprehend it, understand it, produce the language, and acquire the language. So आप कैसे उसको समझते हैं, कैसे उसको डिलीवर करते हैं, और कैसे उसको हासिल करते हैं लैंग्वेज को. यानी आपका सीखना, आपका यूज करना उसका, और आपको उसको समझना. Now, psycholinguistics is part of the field of cognitive sciences. Cognitive sciences का एक part है psycholinguistics. Cognitive sciences reflects the insights of psychology and linguistics, but also of other fields as artificial intelligence, neuroscience, neuropsychology, and philosophy. So, cognitive sciences तो काफी vast study आ जाती है. What it's doing is it's studying the psychology and linguistics. It's studying the artificial intelligence. Now, do you know what artificial intelligence is? Artificial intelligence is computers, robots, such things that are man-made, that man feeds the intelligence in. Now, even with computers, whatever information we feed in a computer, that's what we get from it. A computer does not have a brain of its own. There have been so many experiments trying to explain this, that how can a computer win from a human brain? Well, it can't, because if we use our brains to a certain level, we know that humans are much more superior, because all of this artificial intelligence is created by human beings. So, cognitive sciences studies all of these in a more detailed way, and neuroscience, neuropsychology related to the brain, and philosophy. So, psycholinguistics stresses the knowledge of language. Now, even though cognitive sciences, psycholinguistics is a part of cognitive sciences is a vast field. So, it covers so many things. Now, within that field, psycholinguistics stresses the knowledge of language and the cognitive processes or psychological mechanisms, how your brain works, the mechanism of your psychology, involved in ordinary language use, how you use your brain in ordinary language. Psycholinguistics is also interested in social rules involved in language use. So, with sociolinguistics, like I told you before, and the brain mechanisms associated with language neurolinguistics. So, there are two things. Now, it's also, psycholinguistics not only studies just the brain and how the brain processes a language, but also how that language is affected by the social rules involved in a language use. So that would be the study, sociolinguistics, that we will study further on. And brain mechanisms associated with language neurolinguistics. So although language is essentially a social phenomena, psychology and therefore psycholinguistics is principally the study of individuals. So basically, even though it's a social phenomenon, and but psycholinguistics is principally the study of individuals. Like an individual would study a single thing and learn about the psychology of a language. There are three questions that we would put to it, which I would like you to consider. Now, how we perceive and understand speech? How do you think so? How do you think that we perceive and understand speech and written language? हम कैसे समझते हैं लैंग्वेज को? हम बोले जाने वाली और लिखी हुई लैंग्वेज को हम परसीव कैसे करते हैं और हम उसको अंडरस्टैंड कैसे करते हैं? Second part would be how we construct an utterance from idea to completed sentence. और फिर हम सेंटेंस फॉर्म कैसे करते हैं, जुमले कैसे बनाते हैं, कंस्ट्रक्ट कैसे करते हैं. Utterance would be a single word or a sound. हम उनसे मजीद complete sentence कैसे बनाएंगे. Then how children acquire language. बच्चे language कैसे acquire करते हैं. Now that's a very easy question. I told you before that the children acquire language through imitation and through the sound systems. So, as the name implies, psycholinguistics is principally an integration of the fields of psychology and linguistics. Although, like most interdisciplinary fields, psycholinguistics has a rich heritage that includes contributions from diverse intellectual traditions, giving rise to some controversies in how to best think of or study language and language processes. So, as it implies, like it's the integration of psychology and linguistics, a mixture, a combination. But like most different disciplines, this also has parts. So psycholinguistics has a rich heritage, that means from what we were studying before and how psycholinguistics started developing. That includes contributions from intellectual traditions, giving rise to some controversies. Sometimes there are controversies, things that people don't agree to, and how to best think of your study and how you process a language. Now, psycholinguistics essentially addresses two questions. First, what knowledge of language is needed for us to use language? Now, these are very important questions because these are the questions that you need to know the answers for. All of the questions that are going through these slides are very important. So what I would like you students to do is to note down these questions separately and then write an answer for it. So when you're writing down an answer, the thing is you're saving it to your memory. When you're just thinking about it, then you can get diverted, you can start thinking about something else and then you would lose the thought and forget about it. So in this, what you want to do is that you want to write the answers down. That would help you memorize it. So, what knowledge of language is needed for us to use language? I put that question to you before also, that आपको ऐसी क्या लैंग्वेज की कितनी नॉलेज चाहिए या क्या नॉलेज चाहिए ताकि आप एक लैंग्वेज को प्रॉपर्ली यूज कर सकें? क्या क्या आपके लिए उसमें जानना ज़रूरी है? स्ट्रक्चर, ग्रामर, वोकैबुलरी, प्रोनाउंसिएशन, साउंड्स. What cognitive processes are involved in the ordinary use of language? फिर कौन से cognitive processes है जो ordinary use of language में हम use करते हैं? That's important also. Now, in a sense, we must know a language in order to use it. जब तक हमें language का पता नहीं होगा, knowledge नहीं होगी, हम उसको use नहीं कर सकते. Like if I want to learn, let's say French, I cannot start using that language until I know the meaning of the words I'm using. But normally we are not fully aware of this knowledge. ज़्यादातर लेकिन knowledge को अगर हमें language के बारे में पता नहीं भी है, तो we start using the words, which sometimes we make mistakes. Now, we must have a tacit knowledge. So we need to have a knowledge of a language before we start using it, either in written form or in spoken. Now, tacit knowledge. What is tacit knowledge? Tacit knowledge refers to the knowledge of how to perform various acts. Tacit knowledge हमें ज़रूरी है, लेकिन tacit knowledge क्या है? It refers to the knowledge of how to perform various acts. हम कैसे perform करेंगे various acts. Whereas explicit knowledge refers to the knowledge of the processes or mechanisms used in these acts. So दो चीजें हो गई, tacit knowledge हो गई and explicit knowledge हो गई. अब tacit knowledge आपको बहुत ज़रूरी है किसी भी language को use करने के लिए. Tacit knowledge क्या है? How you perform various acts of language. आप उसको कैसे परफॉर्म करते हैं, स्ट्रक्चर कैसे देते हैं, ग्रामर कैसे यूज करते हैं, प्रोनाउंस कैसे करते हैं. और जबकि एक्सप्लिसिट नॉलेज, now that refers to the process of mechanisms used in these acts. I mean acts को हम ग्रामर सीखने के लिए क्या एक्ट लेंगे, हम प्रोनाउंसिएशन के लिए क्या एक्ट यूज करेंगे, क्या फॉर्म यूज करेंगे, ये चीज एक्सप्लिसिट नॉलेज में आ जाएगी. We sometimes know how to do something without knowing how we do it. A tennisman might know how to serve a ball 150 kilometers per hour, but might have little or no explicit knowledge of the muscles that are involved in this act. यानी बहुत दफ़ा हम ऐसी चीज़ें कर देते हैं जब हमें ये भी नहीं पता कि हमने कैसे किया हो. हमें ये नॉलेज है कि हम ये कर सकते हैं, पर हमें ये नॉलेज नहीं है कि हम कैसे कर सकते हैं या उसमें क्या क्या चीज़ें इन्वॉल्व हैं. फॉर एग्जाम्पल, अभी इन्होंने एग्जाम्पल दिए, एक मैन जो टेनिस खेलता हो, ठीक है, टेनिस मैन, उसको शायद ये ज़रूर पता है कि वो 150 किलोमीटर्स पर आवर की स्पीड से बॉल को सर्व कर सकता है, ठीक है, डिलीवर कर सकता है. सेम थिंग लाइक इन क्रिकेट, लाइक अ पर्सन विल नो मे बी कि a bowler will know how, at what speed he can throw a ball per hour. पर उसके पास हो सकता है शायद ये एक्सप्लिसिट नॉलेज ना हो कि वो उस एक्ट में, उस बॉल थ्रोइंग में उसके कौन कौन से मसल्स जो है वो इन्वॉल्व हैं. सो दैट वुड बी एक्सप्लिसिट नॉलेज. ये जानना टैसिट नॉलेज है कि he knows that I can throw a ball at such and such speed. But explicit knowledge would be to know the details of what muscles are involved in throwing that. Similarly, we may distinguish between knowing how to speak and knowing what processes are involved in producing or understanding speech. So sometimes इसी तरह we can distinguish, हम लोग फर्क जान सकते हैं between knowing how to speak, किस तरह बोलना है, knowing what processes are involved in producing or understanding speech, और ये जानना कि क्या क्या processes है इसमें कि हम speech produce कर सकें, and then understanding speech. Generally, much of our linguistic knowledge is tacit rather than explicit. जनरल व्यू से अगर हम देखें तो हमारी ज़्यादा लिंग्विस्टिक नॉलेज जो है वो टैसिट ही होगी, हमें बेसिक्स ही पता होंगे. एक्सप्लिसिट नॉलेज में हम नहीं जाते. वी डोंट गो वेरी फर्दर इन डिटेल्स ऑफ एक्सप्लेनिंग समथिंग दैट सच एंड सच इज हाउ वी कंडक्टेड सच एन एक्ट. सो द नॉलेज क्वेश्चन वुड बी, now what is the knowledge question? The knowledge question would be what knowledge of language is needed for us to use language. Once again, you have to answer that now. यानी आपको क्या नॉलेज चाहिए किसी लैंग्वेज को यूज करने के लिए, सिर्फ टैसिट या एक्सप्लिसिट या बोथ. 4 broad areas of language knowledge may be distinguished. अब हम अगर ब्रॉडर व्यू से देखें तो लैंग्वेज नॉलेज में 4 ऐसे एरियाज हैं, ठीक है. फोनोलॉजी है, सिंटैक्स है, सेमांटिक्स है, प्रैग्मेटिक्स है. एंड दीज आर ऑल पार्ट ऑफ लिंग्विस्टिक्स. इफ यू वांट टू लर्न अबाउट देम फर्दर ऑन यू कैन check it out and learn about these things separately also. But I've given you a brief description here so you understand it. Now, 4 broad areas for language learning. Phonology. अब phonology क्या है? It deals with the systems of sounds used in a particular language. Phonology वो चीज़ है जो sounds जो आपके language में create होते हैं, the way a word would sound in a particular language. That would be phonology. Syntax क्या है? deals with the grammatical arrangement of words within sentences. Syntax would be the structure, how the sentence is constructed, how we put words together to form a sentence. उसमें grammatical arrangement आ जाती है कि आप grammar कैसे use करते हैं, the tenses you use. एक sentence के अंदर किस form में आपने grammar rules को use किया. Semantics. Now, semantics जो है, like I told you, deals with the meanings of sentences and words. Semantics की study ये language में आ जाएगी, ये part आ जाएगा, to learn the meanings of sentences. जुमलों का मतलब सीखना और words के मतलब सीखना है. That would be semantic knowledge. Pragmatics. Now, pragmatics deals with the social rules involved in a language use. सोशल रूल्स क्या हैं pragmatics? आप किस रूल्स के मुताबिक जो है लैंग्वेज यूज करते हैं या क्या चीज इन्वॉल्व होती है उसमें. So 4 parts, 4 broad areas of knowledge: phonology, syntax, semantics, and pragmatics. So the processes question. The knowledge question was what knowledge you need to use a language. The processes question: what cognitive processes are involved in the ordinary use of language. Knowledge question का आंसर previous slide में आपने देखा, ठीक है? We need to know semantics, phonology, and pragmatics, and so on and so forth. And what they do, we need to know the meanings of words. We need to know how to construct a sentence, and so cognitive processes. अब वो कैसे involved है ordinary use of language में? Now, in ordinary language, by ordinary use of language, I mean such things as understanding a lecture, reading a book, writing a letter, holding a conversation, etc. अब ordinary language हमारी यही है. What you are doing right now, trying to understand this lecture, that would be ordinary language. Reading a book, also trying to understand what's written in a book. Writing a letter, holding a conversation, talking to somebody. So by cognitive processes, I mean processes such as perception, memory, thinking, or reasoning. Kinds of information processing. So cognitive processes आपके क्या आ गए? उसमें आपके perception आ गई, आपने किस तरह perceive किया, आपकी memory आ गई, याददाश्त आ गई आपकी, thinking और reasoning. काइंड्स ऑफ इंफॉर्मेशन प्रोसेसिंग, आप उसको इंफॉर्मेशन को प्रोसेस कैसे करते हो, उसको थिंक कर रहे हो, उसके बारे में रीजन कर रहे हो, उसका आप मकसद निकाल रहे हो ना. द इंटरप्ले ऑफ लिंग्विस्टिक नॉलेज एंड लैंग्वेज प्रोसेसेस इज अ कंटिन्यूइंग थीम ऑफ साइकोलिंग्विस्टिक्स. सो इंटरप्ले ऑफ लिंग्विस्टिक नॉलेज जो है बेसिकली इन लैंग्वेज प्रोसेसेस, ये कंटिन्यूस थीम है, एक मुसलसल चलता जा रहा है साइकोलिंग्विस्टिक्स में. यू आर लर्निंग अबाउट इट, about language processes, about linguistic knowledge. So now let us briefly examine 3 examples of this interplay to illustrate both the concept of linguistic knowledge and the concept of cognitive processing. अब हम इसी चीज के लिए एग्जाम्पल एक लेते हैं, ठीक है? 3 एग्जाम्पल्स लेते हैं जो आपको एक्सप्लेन करेगा कॉन्सेप्ट ऑफ लिंग्विस्टिक नॉलेज क्या है और cognitive processing क्या है, in a way that highlights the types of questions a psycholinguist is likely to ask, ताकि आप वो हाईलाइट कर सकें कि उस टाइप ऑफ क्वेश्चंस कि एक साइकोलिंग्विस्ट जो है वो आपसे किस टाइप के क्वेश्चंस पूछ सकता है और आपको किस टाइप्स के क्वेश्चंस का आंसर्स पता होना चाहिए ताकि आप जवाब दे सकें कि यस दिस इज साइकोलिंग्विस्टिक्स. दैट्स व्हेन यू नो दैट यू नो द सब्जेक्ट. सो in this example there are 3 questions. Now, understanding indirect requests. Indirect request आप understand करना कैसे. Now, what happens when we comprehend a sentence like one? तो नंबर 1 का अगर हम सेंटेंस है उस वक्त क्या होता है कि जब हम ट्राई टू इसको अंडरस्टैंड करने की कोशिश करते हैं. कैन यू शट द डोर? नाउ दिस इज द फर्स्ट क्वेश्चन. इसको हम अंडरस्टैंड करना चाहें तो व्हाट डज इट मीन? कैन यू शट द डोर? डज दैट मीन दैट आई एम आस्किंग यू, आई एम रिक्वेस्टिंग यू टू शट द डोर? एम आई ऑर्डरिंग यू टू शट द डोर? or like am I trying to say that I need the door to be shut? Second question, will you shut the door? Now trying to understand the meaning of this sentence. What I want you to do is trying to understand sentences like this, students. You need to know the differences. Now, can you shut the door means like I'm requesting, can you please get up and shut the door? Will you shut the door? That means I'm asking you that if I ask you to shut the door, will you do it? Are you capable of? Can you get up and do it? Do you feel like doing it? So, will you shut the door? It is getting cold in here. So I'm giving you an example of it now. That it's getting cold in here, so will you please shut the door? Now I'm giving you a reason for it. Then you also see that why not shut the door? Now that's giving you an option. अब मैं आपको एक ऑप्शन दे रही हूँ. पहले में मैंने आपको एक रिक्वेस्ट की, सेकंड में मैंने आपसे पूछा कि क्या आप बंद कर सकते हैं दरवाजा. थर्ड would be giving you a reason कि because it's getting cold, अंदर सर्दी हो रही है. Why not shut the door? डोर क्यों नहीं बंद कर देते हम? तो ये एक क्वेश्चन है. मैं आपसे I'm asking you in a question format. Why not shut the door? दरवाजा बंद क्यों नहीं कर देते? That means कि मेरी ओपिनियन, मेरी ख्वाहिश है कि दरवाजा बंद हो. What about you? So that would be understanding the sentence, would be understanding the meaning. Now, concept is the same, shutting the door. That's one thing. अब उस एक ही चीज को कितने different forms में बता दिया गया आपको. Now that's where understanding the language comes up. Then why not shut the door? That's giving you an option. And the last would be, must you shut the door? क्या लाजमी है दरवाजा बंद करना? So that's also a question. That means that's showing that I don't want you to shut the door. But क्या जरूरी है? So एक ही concept about shutting the door, but there are so different meanings, you see. So that is what you mean by when you're using indirect requests and you are using language. अब language समझना ये चीज है. That's how your mind will perceive it. अब मैं आपको ये चीज कहूँ, will you shut the door or why not shut the door? ठीक है? Why not shut the door जब मैं आपको कहूँगी. Now every human being has a different way of perceiving thought and meanings. You might understand it by saying that, like either I'm saying that दरवाज़ा बंद कर देना चाहिए हमें. Now, लेकिन I didn't point out. आपको शायद ये समझ आए कि मैंने आपको कहा है बंद करने को. Maybe, या आपको मैंने ये चीज़ कही कि मैं उठ के कर देती हूँ बंद. So ये आपकी अपनी perception होगी. हर इंसान की different perception है कि वो अपने mind से किस तरह understand, perceive करता है language को. Now literally this sentence asks if we have the ability to shut the door, but everybody assumes the speaker is asking us. अब हर sentence में अगर आप देखें, can you shut the door, will you shut the door, why not shut the door, must you shut the door, it's getting cold in here, all of this says that ये जुमला ये कहना चाह रहा है कि हमारे ability है दरवाज़ा बंद करने की. और बात करने से समझ ये आती है कि everybody would assume the speaker is asking us in an indirect manner to shut the door. कि जो बोल रहा है वो indirectly आपको ये कह रहा है कि दरवाज़ा बंद करें. So that's how you would understand it. But like I said, it depends on every person's perception. So an interesting fact about indirect speech acts is that although there is no direct relationship between the form of sentence and its intended meaning, listeners apparently have little trouble comprehending these speech acts. So इसका indirect speech acts में ये चीज़ें हम direct तो नहीं बात कर रहे, we are saying it in an indirect way. मैंने pinpoint करके ये नहीं कहा कि आप उठो और जाके बंद करो या आप उठो और जाके बंद करो दरवाज़ा. But indirect way में कहा कि दरवाज़ा बंद होना चाहिए. So that there is no a direct relationship between the form of the sentence, but उसका meaning तो आपको समझ आ गया ना, ठीक है, आपको intended meaning समझ आ गया. So listeners apparently have little trouble comprehending or understanding this speech act. Now in number 1, can you shut the door? The speaker questions the ability of the interlocutor to perform the action. Interlocutor would be the person who is listening, ठीक है. So speaker का ये question है कि उसके अंदर क्या ability है ये action करने की. Can you? कर सकते हो, possible है. So other ways could be used, for example, the question to interlocutor's willingness to perform the desired action, as in to. Will you? आपकी डिज़ायर पूछी जा रही, ख्वाहिश पूछी जा रही है, आपका ओपिनियन लिया जा रहा है. Or indicate, or to indicate the reason why such an action needs to be done, like in 3, ये बताना कि ये action क्यों होना चाहिए, like it's getting cold in here, तो ये action इसलिए दरवाज़ा बंद होना चाहिए. Or in 4, the speaker wants to the door to be shut. 4th में वो ये चीज़ स्पीकर कन्वे कर रहा है कि उसको दरवाज़ा बंद चाहिए. Whilst in 5, the speaker normally wants the door to remain open. So 5th में जब उसने कहा कि must you shut the door, क्या लाजमी है दरवाज़ा बंद करना. So indirectly मैं इस स्पीच में कहना ये चाह रही हूँ कि मुझे दरवाज़ा खुला ही चाहिए, बंद नहीं करना. So this is how we perceive language. Why is the request phrased indirectly? Now that's a question. Why do we phrase it indirectly? Now part of the reason is that we know certain rules about the use of language in social settings, because we have learned them, including rules of politeness. So हम request क्यों करते हैं? क्योंकि हमने certain rules सीखे हैं एक language को use करने के लिए. So social settings में जाके. So अब क्योंकि हमने सीखा है, so politeness का एक main rule है, ठीक है. Just to be polite, we would ask or request somebody to do something. Ordering somebody would not be polite. A request is by definition an attempt to change another person's behavior. किसी और का behavior change करना या बदलाव लाने के लिए request की जाती है. So definition में तो request का मतलब ये बनता है. Now this can be perceived as intrusive at times, so we soften it with indirect speech. So sometimes maybe somebody would be offended by it कि जी it's like saying it in a request but intrusive or interrupting होगा, maybe disturbing हो, so हम उसको indirect speech से soften कर देते हैं. उसका impact, उसका जो असर है वो थोड़ा नरम कर देते हैं. So an indirect request is more polite than a direct command, such as pass the salt or shut the door. We know this as it is a part of our pragmatic knowledge of our language. So ये हमें क्यों पता है? ये हमारी pragmatic knowledge में आता है जब हम language के बारे में जानते हैं. So when we say pass the salt, that would be less polite, then that would be more of a command. जब आप किसी को हुक्म दे रहे हो कि मुझे salt नमक दिया जाए. But when I would say that, can you please pass the salt, or can you pass the salt, that's when I'm requesting you कि क्या आप दे सकते हैं salt. Same thing like shutting the door. So that's how when we use the knowledge of pragmatic. Now from a processing standpoint, a speaker takes this pragmatic knowledge into account when producing a sentence. Like 1, in a social situation. जब social situation में हम होते हैं, जब question 1 था, can you shut the door? Processing standpoint से speaker takes this pragmatic knowledge into account when producing a sentence. जब sentence produce कर रहा होगा. Now that is, the speaker utters the sentence with the understanding that it will be taken as a request. अब स्पीकर ने ये चीज़ की कि उसने ये सेंटेंस इस तरह बोला when he is trying to make it understood कि ये एक रिक्वेस्ट की सूरत में ही जाए. Now the listener presumably shares this aspect of pragmatic knowledge. and interprets the sentence as a request rather than in a literal manner. So, listener जो होगा, जो आपको सुन रहा होगी बात या सुन रहा होगा, once again, pragmatic knowledge उसके पास भी होगी, an understanding. And they would interpret it or they would understand it, the sentence request की सूरत में, बजाय के उसको literal manner as a command लें. Now, yet the exact processes by which the listener arrives at the non-literal meaning are not fully clear. लेकिन ये exact process जो है कि वो बोलने वाले से सुनने वाले तक ये बात किस सेंस में पहुंची, ये अभी तक क्लियर नहीं है. ये फुल्ली हम लोग कभी भी डिस्कवर नहीं कर सके कि नॉन लिटरल मीनिंग क्या होगा. So some authors assume that the listener first extracts the literal meaning of the sentence, then decides on the basis of the context. So कुछ authors ये कहेंगे कि जो listener है, सुनने वाला है, वो first उसका literal meaning extract करता है, निकाल लेता है sentence में से, फिर decide करता है कि उसका क्या basis या किस तरीके से कहा गया है उसको. That the literal meaning is not what the speaker intended before computing an indirect meaning. So where Carroll ने reference दिया है, this is again like I mentioned to you before, a reference that you can check and indicate it by on 227, and the ET is 139. So page 227 of the book of Carroll. So इसमें उन्होंने ये हवाला दिया कि sometimes literal meaning of the sentence is some authors would say कि वो पहले उसका literal meaning समझते हैं listener, and then they decide on कि उसका क्या मतलब निकाला है. Do you think that happens? Do you do that, students? I would think that when we are learning a language, we automatically can't describe how we find out, but we know. So my mind would say that it's by the tone of voice matters a lot also. जिस tone से आप कहते हैं, जिस अंदाज में आप कहते हैं. अब यही चीज जुमला, if I would shout and say, can you shut the door? ये चीज उस पे जोर and command and anger show होगा. That's when a listener would perceive it as a command. But when I would ask it in a nice way, can you shut the door? So मेरे ख्याल में लहजे का भी बहुत फर्क पड़ता है आपके. So लेकिन कुछ authors का ये कहना, other authors considered that it is not always necessary to compute a direct meaning prior to indirect meaning. So कुछ authors ये भी कहते हैं कि ज़रूरी नहीं है कि उसका direct meaning ही पहले समझ आए तो फिर indirect meaning ये नहीं ये समझ आएगा कि हाँ direct meaning के order दिया गया और indirect के फिर ये request form में दिया गया. So first computing the literal meaning would only be a special strategy only used when an indirect speech act is presented either in a way that does not fit with previous discourse or with no context at all. या तो उसका कोई कॉन्टेक्स्ट नहीं है या प्रीवियस जो भी बात चल रही है, डिस्कशन चल रही है, उसमें फिट नहीं आती, तो देन यू वुड से दैट यस दैट स्ट्रैटेजी वुड बी यूज्ड कि आप पहले उसका लिटरल मीनिंग निकालोगे, फिर उसका आप मतलब ये नहीं ये देखोगे कि वो रिक्वेस्टिंग फॉर्म में या उसका इनडायरेक्ट स्पीच किस वे में आपको किया गया. नाउ एग्जाम्पल 2 फॉर दैट वुड बी दैट सेंटेंस पार्सिंग स्ट्रैटेजीज. सेंटेंस पार्सिंग, अब पार्सिंग क्या है? What happens when we understand a sentence? Sentence parsing strategies. Parsing means trying to understand a sentence. So what happens when we understand a sentence like one? Number one, जब हम क्या होगा when we try to understand a sentence like this? The teacher bores the students. Teacher जो है students को bore कर रहा है. Now that doesn't mean that you want to say that I'm boring you. I know that our subject is quite boring, but it's very important for you to learn it also. So this is just an example. The teacher bores the students. Definition of parsing. Now a definition of parsing would be a first step in the process of understanding a sentence. is to assign the elements of this sentence to linguistic categories, a procedure known as parsing. Parsing क्या है basically? उसकी definition क्या है कि ये first step है, process of understanding. कोई भी चीज़ समझने में के process में या एक जुमले को समझने के process में ये सबसे पहला step है, पहला कदम है, in which we assign the elements of this sentence to linguistic categories. कि हम उस जुमले की elements जो हैं, उसकी जो fact है, उसका structure है, उसको हम linguistic categories में डाल के understand करते हैं. A procedure known as parsing. ये parsing होगा. Okay, dear students, I think this is enough for today. We will continue learning about parsing strategies and about psycholinguistics in the further lectures, and I'll further explain how parsing is used in my next lecture. So I hope you understood everything. Thank you.